It is the 9th of April, 1945, and inside a requisitioned forestry lodge near Wuppertal, a lamp burns low over a table covered in colored pins. The man staring at it has not slept properly in a fortnight. He is Field Marshal Walther Model, commander of Army Group B, and the object in front of him is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It has no barrel, no explosive charge, no moving parts at all. It is a map, hand-annotated, constantly updated, marked in red and blue grease pencil by exhausted staff officers working in shifts. It shows something Model already suspects but has not yet allowed himself to fully accept: that more than 300,000 German soldiers, his soldiers, are now sealed inside a pocket barely 80 kilometers across, with no route out, no reinforcement coming, and an enemy that grows stronger by the hour. Within a fortnight of this moment, Model will disband the greatest concentration of German manpower still in the field, and take a pistol into a quiet forest near Duisburg rather than surrender it. The map on the table did not fire a shot. It did not need to. It told the truth more effectively than any weapon on either side, and that is precisely why it matters. This is the story of that situation map, the Lagekarte of the Ruhr pocket, and how a piece of paper became one of the most psychologically decisive objects of the entire war in the West. By the spring of 1945, the German army had spent 5.5 years perfecting the art of denial. Situation maps at every level of command, from divisional headquarters up to the Führer's own map table in Berlin, had long since become instruments of self-deception as much as tools of war. Units that existed only on paper were shown at full strength. Divisions reduced to a few hundred exhausted men were marked with the same solid blue rectangles as formations at full establishment. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from the reality on the ground, moved colored blocks across maps in his Berlin bunker representing armies that had already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. This was not simply optimism. It was a structural problem baked into how the Wehrmacht processed and reported information under a leadership that punished bad news and rewarded confident fiction. Model himself understood this culture better than most. He had risen through the ranks precisely because he was willing to tell Hitler things other generals would not, earning the nickname the Führer's fireman for his habit of arriving at collapsing sectors of the front and stabilizing them through sheer force of will and improvisation. But even Model operated within a system where the map on the wall was, more often than not, an aspiration rather than a record. Staff officers learned early in their careers which symbols pleased a visiting inspector and which invited awkward questions. A weakened regiment might be shown as a full battalion. A withdrawal might be relabeled on paper as a shortening of the line. None of this was unique to the German army. Every military bureaucracy under pressure developed some tendency to soften bad news in transit. But by 1945, with defeat compounding on defeat, the gap between the German army's paper strength and its actual fighting capacity had widened into a chasm, and nowhere would that chasm become more starkly visible than inside the shrinking perimeter of the Ruhr. The trouble was that maps drawn this way could not survive contact with a genuinely collapsing front. By late March 1945, the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine at multiple points. Montgomery's 21st Army Group had gone over in the north near Wesel, with an enormous set-piece assault, Operation Plunder, on the 23rd and 24th of March. Further south, American forces under Bradley had already bounced the river almost unopposed at Remagen after finding the Ludendorff Bridge intact, and Patton's Third Army had crossed near Oppenheim before anyone in Berlin had properly registered the danger. Within days, American 1st and 9th Armies were driving east and then turning to close a pincer around the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. By the 1st of April, the encirclement was complete. Model's Army Group B, along with the German 5th Panzer Army, the 15th Army, and a patchwork of scratch formations, Home Guard battalions, and anti-aircraft units pressed into infantry roles, found itself trapped in the largest single encirclement the Wehrmacht had suffered on any front, larger even than Stalingrad in terms of raw numbers, though far less remembered. The problem facing Model's staff was not military in the traditional sense. It was informational. For the encirclement to be properly understood, someone had to draw it accurately, and accuracy was the one thing German situation maps had been engineered for years to avoid. A map that told the truth about a force reduced from divisions to remnants, about ammunition stocks measured in single days rather than weeks, about fuel reserves that could move armor perhaps 40 kilometers before running dry, was not a map anyone wanted to produce. And yet, trapped, cut off from Berlin's fantasies, Model's intelligence officers had no choice. Radio contact with the OKW, the German High Command, was patchy and often jammed. Fuel to move liaison officers between formations was almost gone. The map had to be built from whatever fragments made it back to the lodge at Wuppertal. Scrawled reports carried by motorcycle dispatch riders threading between American armored columns, aerial reconnaissance photographs developed under lamplight, and the grim arithmetic of divisions that reported in as battalions and battalions that reported in as companies. What made this particular map so devastating was not artistry or technical sophistication. It was honesty forced by circumstance. German cartographers on Model's staff, working with standard 1 to 100,000 scale topographic sheets of the Ruhr region, began overlaying acetate sheets showing, for what may have been the first time in months, the genuine perimeter of German-held territory rather than the perimeter Berlin wished existed. The pocket, sketched in red grease pencil, shrank visibly day by day as American forces compressed it from the north, west, and south. Blue arrows, usually the symbol of German offensive intent throughout the war, now marked American thrusts driving into the heart of the industrial cities of Essen, Dortmund, and Wuppertal itself. Unit symbols that would once have represented full-strength divisions of around 15,000 men were annotated, in the small, cramped handwriting of staff officers with actual effective strengths. A few hundred men here, a composite battle group of cooks and clerks there, entire divisions that existed as little more than a headquarters and a flag. The map itself was physically unremarkable. It measured perhaps 1.5 meters across, pinned to a folding easel of the sort used at every German staff headquarters since well before the war, roughly the size of a large dining table laid on its side. What made it extraordinary was what it was forced to show. Unlike the fantasy maps still being updated in Berlin, where Hitler continued to order counterattacks by formations that had ceased to exist, the Ruhr pocket map was compiled under conditions where lying was no longer physically possible. There was nowhere to retreat to. There was no reinforcement to promise. Every red line drawn on that acetate overlay represented a piece of ground that had actually been lost, confirmed by officers who had, in many cases, watched it happen with their own eyes through binoculars from a church tower or a factory roof. Production of these situation maps, if the word production can even be applied to something drawn largely by hand under artillery fire, fell to a small team within Model's operations staff, working with whatever printing and duplicating equipment could be salvaged from Wehrmacht supply depots before they were overrun. Updates were issued when possible, twice daily, at dawn and at dusk, the two moments when reports from the collapsing perimeter were most likely to have filtered back through. By the second week of April, the interval between updates had to lengthen simply because there was less and less genuine information left to update the map with. What had begun as a piece of military cartography had become, in effect, a slow-motion obituary for an army. The operational use of the map, if it can be called that, was almost entirely psychological rather than tactical by this stage. Model held a series of conferences with his subordinate commanders in the second week of April, using the map as the centerpiece around which the entire discussion turned. Survivors of these meetings, interviewed decades later by historians researching the final collapse of Army Group B, described officers standing in silence around the easel, watching Model trace the shrinking perimeter with a pointer, no longer discussing how to break out, but how to manage the inevitable. General Fritz Bayerlein, Commanding what remained of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's most storied armored formations reduced by this point to a handful of tanks and a few thousand exhausted men, reportedly told colleagues that seeing the encirclement laid out in full, rather than hearing it described piecemeal through fragmentary reports, changed something in how the staff spoke about the situation. The war had, in the space of those meetings, stopped being discussed as something to be won or even survived intact, and started being discussed as something to be ended with whatever dignity remained available. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this story still to come. It is worth pausing here to compare how the two sides were handling situation mapping in these final weeks, because the contrast is genuinely stark. American and British forces, by 1945, had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated and, crucially, largely honest system of situation reporting, built around standardized map symbols, regular photographic reconnaissance updates, and a culture, imperfect but real, that rewarded accurate reporting of setbacks as much as successes. Allied situation maps at 21st Army Group headquarters were compiled from multiple corroborating sources: signals intelligence, aerial photography, prisoner interrogation, and unit reports cross-checked against one another, updated on a rolling basis by dedicated intelligence staff who had no institutional incentive to flatter the picture. This was not because Allied officers were inherently more honest men than their German counterparts. It was because the culture Eisenhower and Montgomery had built, however imperfectly, punished commanders less severely for admitting a position had collapsed than Hitler's regime punished the same honesty. The Ruhr pocket map, by contrast, was accurate, not because German staff culture had suddenly reformed itself, but because reality had become so overwhelming that fiction was no longer physically sustainable. It represents, in a strange way, honesty by exhaustion rather than honesty by design, and that distinction matters enormously to how historians now read it. Compare this, too, with the maps still being updated in Hitler's Berlin bunker during these same weeks, where formations already destroyed continued to be shown at full strength, where the Ninth Army under General Theodor Buss, itself soon to be encircled and shattered east of Berlin, was still being marked as capable of offensive maneuver days after it had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The gulf between what Berlin believed and what Model's map showed was, by mid-April, almost total, and it was Model's map that reflected the war as it actually was. There is, too, the question of what became of the men who read the map alongside Model. Not every commander in the pocket reacted the same way. Some, particularly younger officers, argued for a breakout attempt, however desperate, on the grounds that surrender was unthinkable, regardless of what any map showed. Model listened to these arguments, and in the early days of the encirclement, he did explore the possibility, ordering probing attacks along the eastern edge of the pocket in the first days of April to test whether a corridor might still be forced open toward the retreating remnants of other German formations further east. Each attempt was reported back in turn on the map itself. A blue arrow drawn optimistically one evening, erased and replaced with a red line marking further territorial loss the following morning. It was this repeated, visible failure of every attempted solution, rather than any single dramatic moment, that seems to have worn down the last of Model's resistance to the obvious conclusion. Historians who have examined the surviving fragments of Army Group B's war diary describe a staff that grew steadily quieter through the second week of April, the arguments about breakout attempts giving way to a kind of exhausted administrative calm, as officers turned instead to the practical business of managing the collapse, destroying equipment that could not be moved, ensuring field kitchens kept functioning for as long as possible, and quietly preparing surrender instructions that would eventually be distributed piecemeal rather than issued as a single formal capitulation. The historical impact of the Ruhr pocket map is difficult to measure with precision, and it would be dishonest to claim it single-handedly ended the fighting in the region. Surrender negotiations, the physical exhaustion of German troops, chronic shortages of ammunition and fuel, and the sheer weight of American numbers all played their part, and any responsible account has to hold those factors alongside the map rather than in place of it. What can be said with more confidence, drawing on post-war interviews with surviving staff officers and the accounts collected by historians such as Samuel Mitcham in his studies of the German officer corps, is that the map functioned as a psychological turning point for Model personally. Model had built a reputation across the war as the Wehrmacht's foremost defensive specialist, a general who found solutions where none seemed to exist, from Rzeów to Arnhem. The map represented, in the starkest visual terms available to him, the moment that reputation met its limit. Some 6 weeks earlier, on the 21st of April, Model formally dissolved Army Group B rather than surrender it as a formal capitulation, releasing older and younger soldiers to attempt to make their own way home and allowing the remainder to surrender individually to advancing American units, a decision that historians generally read as an attempt to spare his men the stigma, as he saw it, of a formal capitulation, while accepting that continued resistance served no purpose the map had not already rendered obvious. 2 days later, on the 21st of April, 1945, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and took his own life, becoming the most senior German officer to do so during the war's final collapse. The map itself, along with much of Model's operational paperwork, did not survive in any single archive, as was common for headquarters documents in the chaos of a collapsing front, though fragments of the situation reports that fed it, along with corroborating American intelligence assessments of the pocket's collapse, are held today in the National Archives and in German military history collections, and it is from these fragments and from post-war testimony that historians have reconstructed the map's central role in the final days of Army Group B. The legacy of the map, if such an unglamorous object can be said to have one, lies less in military history proper and more in how historians have come to understand the collapse of the German army in the final weeks of the war. The Ruhr encirclement is sometimes referred to informally by historians as the Ruhr Kessel, or Ruhr Cauldron, and it stands alongside Stalingrad and the Falaise Gap as one of the 3 catastrophic encirclements that punctuated the Wehrmacht's destruction, though it receives markedly less popular attention than either, perhaps because it produced no dramatic climactic battle, only a slow and largely bloodless deflation. Where Stalingrad ended in a formal, humiliating surrender broadcast to the world, and Falaise in a killing ground of burned-out armor photographed from the air, the Ruhr pocket ended, in large part, with paperwork and silence, 317,000 men by most post-war estimates passing into American captivity over the space of little more than a week, a number so large that American logistics officers reportedly struggled to process and feed the prisoners fast enough. That relative quietness, ironically, may be part of why the map itself has survived so vividly in the testimony of those who saw it, even as the physical document was lost. It was not overshadowed by a single dramatic battle because there was no single dramatic battle. The map, and the slow admission of reality it represented, was the event. Return for a moment to that lodge near Wuppertal, to the lamp burning low and the man staring at a piece of paper that refused to lie to him. Every war produces its decisive weapons, the tanks and aircraft and codes that history remembers with the reverence reserved for things that can be photographed and placed behind glass in a museum. This was not one of those weapons. It could not be fired, could not be flown, could not be broken by a bomb. It was simply the truth, drawn in red and blue grease pencil on a sheet of acetate at a moment when the truth had become the one thing German command could no longer avoid. What the map achieved was not victory in any tactical sense. The war in the West had, by early April 1945, already been decided by armor and by industry, and by the sheer arithmetic of 2 fronts closing on a shrinking Reich. What the map achieved was something narrower and, in its way, more human. It removed the last comfortable illusion available to the man reading it, and in doing so, it convinced Walther Model, one of the Wehrmacht's most capable and stubborn commanders, that continuing to fight served no purpose beyond the accumulation of further, pointless death. 300,000 men walked into American captivity in the days that followed rather than dying in a final, futile defense of ground that had already, in every meaningful sense, been lost. The map did not win the war, but for the men trapped inside the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, it may well have decided whether they lived to see its end.